And so here we are, and we're really getting up to the exciting bits now. Chapter 17, The Gate. Having raced each other through the caravan site to the pond outside the old house, they stopped to catch their breath at the entrance marked Private. In front of them stood the open gate, with the driveway leading across the lawn to the house itself. The evening sun was beautiful and golden. The shadows were just starting to grow longer, and to their delight, there were no lights showing up at the house. Perhaps there was no one at home. They'd been wondering how on earth they could go through the entrance if there were people around, but they could see no one about, and with no lights on in the house, all seemed to be going well. They looked at each other, aware that now they felt very much more confident. Even so, they carefully went through the gate, but did not walk up the drive. Instead, they crept up the gardens, keeping close to the flower bed on the right-hand side, so that they wouldn't be seen if anyone was watching from the house. They kept checking, but no lights came on in the house, although Beth had the strangest feeling that they were being watched. She led Pip straight up the flower bed until they arrived at the dark green hedge that ran from the corner of the lawn to the right-hand side of the house. Slowly they made their way along the high, forbidding hedge until they came to the little wooden doorway that Catherine had opened into the kitchen garden the other day. Beth took hold of the heavy metal ring which was the door handle, and it was so quiet that they both heard the latch grate on the other side as she began to turn it. Beth pushed, but nothing happened. She pushed harder, saying, "It seemed stiff when Catherine did it." "Move out of the way and let me do it," said Pip. But try as he might, he couldn't shift it either. "They must have bolted it from the inside. We're not going to be able to get in this way." "We'll have to try going round another way," Beth suggested. "Come on." She led the way back along the hedge to the flower border. Here the hedge ended, and the thick woodland trees began. She began to push through the undergrowth because she could see the outside wall of the kitchen garden on her left. This was one of the walls that were fairly broken down. As they followed this, the woodland trees thinned out, and they found themselves in the orchard where Beth had collected the windfalls. "I know where we are!" exclaimed Beth, more than a little relieved that her hunch had been correct. She was still in the lead, and they walked over the grass, along the side of the bramble-covered walls, and soon she could see the little, narrow gate. She put her hand out to open the gate, but before she even tried, Pip said, "Oh no, not again," pointing to a chain with a padlock fitted to it. "That wasn't there the other day," said Beth. "Well, it doesn't look as though it can get in this way either," said Pip disappointedly. "But the walls are not too high at this side. I think I could climb over." Beth looked firstly at the nettles and brambles that clung to the brickwork, and then down at her bare legs. "I'll get scratched and stung," she said. "So I'll go," said Pip, who was wearing his jeans as usual. He started looking for the easiest part to climb, and left Beth forlornly gazing through the gate. It was then that she began remembering. Perhaps because the sky was filled now with orange and golden light, suddenly she found herself thinking about their evening walk with Gramps at sunset the other day. They'd all been looking through the gateway. And what was it that he'd said? Something about gates opening both ways. She'd been worried about the cows getting out of the gate, but Gramps had been talking about the farmer needing to get into the field through the gate. As she thought about the clues they were trying to solve, she began to wonder, which way should they be going through this gate? Did they need to get into the kitchen garden, or had Elizabeth meant they needed to start in the garden and move on from there? She thought of the note that Elizabeth had written. She had heard the horsemen arriving and had run out. Perhaps she'd run out through the back door, out into that herb garden, and then through this gate towards where Beth was standing. She could hear Pip struggling to make his way through the brambles, and went to where he was untangling his foot from an extra long branch. "It's much harder than I thought," he said, "especially now it's getting a bit darker." "Just a minute," she said, and began to explain her thought process to him. "So we might not need to get into the garden at all?" he asked. "That's right," she answered. "And anyway, like you said, it's already getting quite dark. Gramps doesn't like us out after dusk. Let's leave it until tomorrow and go and have another look at those clues to see if we could be right about them starting at the house." "Good idea," he said. Generally, Pip had a really good sense of direction, and as he looked around, he said, "I think we could get back quicker if we cut through the trees. Come on," he said, taking the lead this time. Leaving the narrow gate behind them, they passed through the orchard, thick with fruit trees. Beth noticed the plum tree again. Damsons, she remembered that they were called. The apples came next, just before they got to the hawthorn hedge. Beth was going through the names of the trees as they ran. Damson, apple, hawthorn. They seemed familiar. As they came to the hawthorn hedge, she remembered that she'd seen a gap in it the other day. Pip was already heading that way, and it turned out to lead them down some old steps into a brick path leading into the woodland beyond. As soon as they came to a junction, and then Pip hesitated for a moment. They'd been moving quite fast and making rather a lot of noise. Beth was surprised that when they halted at the crossroads, she could still hear noises behind them. She turned to look, but there was nothing to see. Her mind immediately went back to the shadow, but it couldn't be Mac because he was on their side. What could it be that she could hear? At that moment, Pip interrupted her thoughts and confidently chose the right-hand side turning. This led them through some taller trees and soon brought them out in the corner of the top field. "That was a much quicker way back, wasn't it?" said Pip proudly. "We'll be back at the caravan before it gets really dark." They were just about to cross the narrow road when the world lit up and a big white van came rushing past them, causing them both to jump back into the trees. "Caw, he was going a bit fast," exclaimed Beth, catching her breath. They were really ready for their drinks that night. Pip was flicking through the book, trying to choose a story, when he came across a picture that he'd never noticed before. "Beth," he said, "come and see this." As Beth was coming over, Pip closed the book, leaving his finger in the page. "Watch," he said, and slowly began to open the page. The picture was of a tower in a city wall, but as Pip opened the page further, the whole city seemed to have fallen apart until only a small area was left standing. "At first I thought that the cutout section had been torn," he said, "but every time you open it, the wall seems to be okay until you open the book fully, and then it all looks like it's tumbling down." "That's really clever," said Beth, as she watched Pip open and close the pages again. "Nana," he asked, "can we have this story tonight?" Nana came over to see. "Ah," she said, as she seated herself on the bed, preparing to read. "Joshua and the Battle of Jericho, one of Gramps' favourite stories, full of spies and secret signals and things. You'll enjoy this." And they certainly did. And remember, if you want to find that in the Bible, you can find it in Joshua, the book in the Bible called Joshua, chapter 2 and then chapter 6. So that night, Beth woke up after a very involved dream. She knew she had to try and remember an important list. As she lay there, part of the dream came back to her. It had been the day before her brownie exam, and in her dream she'd been running down a woodland path. She was sure someone was following her. Then, in her dream, she heard Nana calling after her, "Tell me the names of the flowers. Tell me their names for your brownie badge." And Beth found that she was trying to remember the pressed flowers from the diary. Snowdrop, daffodil, bluebell. She woke up, frantically trying to remember which flower came next. "Well, how silly," she thought. "It's weeks before I go back to brownies." But as she lay thinking, she remembered really running through the woodland last night with Pip. But then it had not been flower names that seemed familiar. It had been the names of the trees from Elizabeth's book. Beth turned on the light and decided to look through the diary right then to see if she'd been right about the order of the leaves corresponding to their run home last night. And it only took a moment or two to realise that she was correct. Even though it was the middle of the night, she turned over a new sheet in her notebook and wrote the names of the 7 leaves down in order: rose, damson, apple, hawthorn, sycamore, beech, oak. At least she felt now that she would remember the dream and be able to tell Pip all about it tomorrow.